Okay. Well, what I'm going to do is very quickly, again, just a few words just to introduce the panel and the topic. Um, and this goes to something that has come up in the last two discussions. And I would argue that much of the climate debate, and something I've been involved in for, I hate to say it, over 30 years. Um, so for several decades, policymakers and many advocates of making change have ignored what I like to call energy fundamentals. There are various ways of defining that. We referred to it in this session on the energy security in a whole variety of dimensions, but call it for the moment energy fundamentals. It may not be so much that they ignore it as they just take it for granted, because we usually can take it for granted. It always works, and it's usually affordable. And yet we know that if and when, and the when is inevitable at one point or another, things go wrong in energy systems, and whether that be costs or prices or the allocation of costs, or whether it's reliability or security in the larger geopolitical sense, climate will almost inevitably drop to the bottom of citizen priorities. And we've seen that time and time again. So how do we keep all of those priorities in sight? Not only in sight, but as an active part of policy. So this panel is going to look at different dimensions of this conundrum. So we're going to lead off with Catherine Porter, who is with us virtually. Catherine resides and works in the UK. Recently worked with Monica and me and some others on a project looking at downstream energy systems and some of the perils of policy in that realm. She has a broad and deep experience in the realities of energy transition, and especially the financial realities. So, Catherine, I can see you on the screen. Welcome, and thank you for joining us. Our next speaker is Emily Renaud, who brings a different perspective, not grounded so much in energy, but in the realities faced by the economically disadvantaged, something we often tend to forget about. And if we don't deal with those issues, if we don't deal with the issues of what people sometimes call energy poverty from the outset, many policy measures will simply compound energy poverty, and we know of examples of where that either is true or where it could be true, and there will be no transition. There certainly will not be anything like a just transition. So that has to be on the screen. And then finally, on the stage with me is Debbie Scharf. Debbie is an Associate Assistant Deputy Minister at NRCan. She has several critical responsibilities relevant to this subject, and a great deal of relevant experience in how energy systems, and I emphasize the word systems, can be transformed while responding to all of the energy realities. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sit back down, and then I'll hand it over to Catherine to make a few remarks, and then Emily, if you could pick it up from there, and then Debbie, and then we'll have some open conversation.
Great. So hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be participating in this event today. The topics that we're talking about are very relevant to the market in Britain, as challenges of affordability and security of supply are extremely present in the British market right now. We're experiencing what the press is calling a cost of living crisis, largely driven by rapid increases in energy costs. And there are three factors at play, two of which have received a lot of attention and one which hasn't. Last autumn, we saw global gas prices shoot up as a result of an asymmetric response to the pandemic. Supply was cut by more than demand and took longer to recover. Combined with a cold winter in Europe and then heat waves across much of the Northern Hemisphere last summer, Europe went into last winter with very low gas inventories, and prices ramped up as we had to compete with Asian buyers in the LNG markets. The expectation was that this situation would stabilize sometime in 2022. But the Russian invasion of Ukraine derailed those expectations. With Western buyers now wanting to stop trading with Russia, new gas projects will be needed to come online to replace those volumes, and that's going to support prices for much longer. The other pricing dynamic has received much less attention, and that's the effect of decarbonisation. Many people mistakenly believe that renewable energy is cheap and reduces energy prices. Well, we've been subsidising renewable generation in Britain now for over 20 years. And during that time, we've seen a steady increase in end user prices, a trend which is completely different to the behaviour of wholesale prices during the same period. All of the evidence to date indicates that renewable generation increases end user prices. And when you break it down, you can see why. First of all, we have to pay subsidies to build this generation. Then, because it's intermittent, we have to subsidise conventional generation to be available to provide backup when it isn't windy or sunny. The new generation is built in places that don't have existing network infrastructure. So we have to pay for new grid capacity and also pay curtailment fees to generators when network constraints force them to turn down. And finally, we have to pay much higher balancing costs to maintain a balance between supply and demand in real time, which is harder when a higher proportion of generation is intermittent. Each winter, thousands of people die in Britain as a result of being unable to afford to heat their homes adequately. With some 40% of consumers expected to be in fuel poverty this coming winter, that figure is set to rise. The government has announced support measures that will cover about half of the expected price increases, but this isn't likely to be enough, and there are already signs of self-disconnection among the most vulnerable consumers. The other big area of concern in Britain is around security of supply. Although the focus in the news is on gas markets, the real worry is actually in the electricity markets, where we could see rationing for industrial users this winter. The reason is that the winter capacity margin has been falling steadily, and closing conventional capacity, which makes the highest contribution to margins, is not being replaced on a like-for-like basis. This year, we are expecting 2 gigawatts of nuclear capacity to close, as well as 4 gigawatts of coal capacity. The government tried unsuccessfully to persuade EDF to keep one of its nuclear reactors open and is negotiating with the coal operators to keep their plants open this winter. There's news of some special arrangements being negotiated between the government and these operators. The other huge challenge relates to the situation across the Channel in France. Half of the French nuclear fleet is offline after systemic problems have been identified in the cooling systems of their reactors. The French nuclear regulator believes these problems will take years to fully resolve. This means that instead of exporting, France is now relying on imports, including from Britain. In the past month, we've been exporting to France pretty consistently. That means that come the winter, instead of benefiting from 3 gigawatts of imports from France, we could be exporting 3 gigawatts, a net impact of 6 gigawatts. So the available capacity for the winter could be 12 gigawatts lower than last year, or just over 8 gigawatts on a derated basis. Excluding coal, the reduction is still over 5.5 gigawatts. And finally, the top-up capacity auction for this winter saw a shortfall for the first time ever, with the amount procured being 365 megawatts less than the target. Last winter, the derated capacity margin was 3.9 gigawatts. This is likely to be completely wiped out by the changes I've mentioned. While new renewable generation has been built this year, we can experience periods of up to 2 weeks with no wind output, so this is very concerning. National Grid has said it will issue another indication of the winter margins in next month, but the signs are not good. And even if the coal capacity stays open, capacity margins will be very low, making the grid extremely vulnerable to unplanned outages. Large industrial users are very concerned about the prospect of involuntary curtailment, and the best advice for them is to buy or hire diesel gensets in order to reduce the impact on their operations. The headlines are all about energy costs at the moment, but once we get into the winter, security of supply issues may well emerge to be an even bigger issue. And it's also pretty clear that net zero ambitions are only important until they're not. Affordability and security of supply can very quickly take over, which is why we're now seeing the government scramble to keep the dirtiest old coal power stations open this winter.
Rather uncheerful note, Catherine. The point certainly made rather directly. I'm going to ask Emily to step up. So Emily, over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. I'm very happy to be here today. So I joined the Canada Without Poverty team 2 years ago, but the organization's work goes back by over 50 years. CWP was founded in the 1970s under the former name, the National Anti-Poverty Organization. In 1993, we were the first nonprofit organization to be invited to speak to the United Nations about Canada's human rights performance. We hold that poverty is a violation of human rights, and we promote public awareness and human rights-based policy solutions to eradicate poverty, but crucially to ensure that everyone in this country can live a life with dignity and opportunity. Now, climate change is yet another critical issue to add to our anti-poverty advocacy agenda. And at its core, climate change and energy policy solutions for low-income people must begin with poverty alleviation. So we are hopeful that these intersecting issues can help further our cause. Communities living in poverty have the smallest carbon footprint. They often take transit, they produce less consumer waste and buy used. They do not have multiple homes or cars. They are forced to use less energy, as Catherine was talking about, due to high costs. They do not travel as much, etc. However, they bear the disproportionate burden of climate change costs and effects. Not only do low-income people often live in outdated housing units that are not energy efficient and are vulnerable to floods and storms, but they often don't even have access to proper heating and AC to shelter themselves from more extreme everyday weather conditions that we are already experiencing. So again, as Catherine was saying, we need to be thinking about how to protect and provide these communities immediately, as well as in the long term. Now, climate change solutions as it stands often cater to the middle class through incentives for electric vehicles, solar energy, and carbon tax rebates. But things like the carbon tax rebate, despite people eventually receiving rebates, eat up big portions of lower income people's daily budgets. Low-income people who are reliant on cars, especially those in our rural and remote areas, cannot afford an electric vehicle and won't be able to afford one in the next 10 or 20 years with the way of the economic conditions. So extra dollars at the pump really matter when you live paycheck to paycheck, and people express needing those savings now rather than through a rebate later on. So the government does offer a patchwork of energy benefits right now to low-income people, but they are dependent on, one, filing taxes, which not everyone is able to do for various reasons. And I can address those concerns if people are curious why not everyone is able to file their taxes or choose not to. And further, they're also not automatically applied to all of those who are eligible, even if they have filed their taxes. So for example, Ontario has a hydro credit for low-income people, but this is barely advertised, and it could be saving people hundreds of dollars a year. Such an easy and immediate support would be making these credits and benefits accessible by ensuring automatic enrollment to all those who are eligible, rather than putting the onus on the individual. And I would just like to note here that nearly all benefits that are for low-income people require individual applications. And there is a jurisdictional mess between the federal and provincial government benefits, especially to anyone receiving social assistance or housing. We saw this with the CERB, the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit in 2020, and just how much of a jurisdictional mess and a lack of communication between the governments when it comes to providing supports for low-income people. But then on the flip side, federal carbon tax rebates, and I'm thinking of the climate action incentive payment for provinces who do not have their own provincial tax rebates, such as Alberta and Ontario, are automatically applied to all who file their taxes. So why are we not ensuring that our low-income people are receiving benefits that they qualify for and desperately need, while ensuring everyone can have this carbon tax rebate? We treat policy very unfairly in this country. Something CWP does is we focus and center on the lived experiences. So I'm just going to take a minute to ground this all in a real concrete personal example. As many of you may have experienced, the big storm hit Ottawa in late May and left many people without power for days to weeks. My father, who lives in a low-income neighborhood in the East End, did not have electricity for nearly 2 weeks, which meant he had to throw out hundreds of dollars of food from the fridge, and he was spending $40 a day on takeout, while he only earns $130 a day in his construction job. And that comes to 31% of his daily income going towards food in this emergency situation, not to mention the extra gas he needed to pick up that food, even though he was already struggling with the high gas prices before the storm hit. People cannot afford these emergency crises even once, but more and more of these disasters are yet to come. My dad, who has a house, was actually lucky. Imagine the stress of displacement from those who have trees crash down on their roofs or having their homes literally washed away, such as in the case with the BC floods last year. Imagine how terrifying and devastating these disasters are to those who are unhoused, having their few possessions blown away, no shelter for protection. Again, there's so much talk around oil and gas and energy, but we often leave out our most vulnerable and housing insecure people out of the conversation. Affordable and reliable energy solutions are not just an opportunity for investment and growth, but also for better redistribution. We do currently have so many resources and such vast economic wealth in this country. And the only reason why people continue to live in poverty is because of a lack of political and public will to address inequality and inequity. The conversation is so much more than affordable energy. Climate change and poverty are human rights issues, and we must treat them as such. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Emily, and your personal example really does bring it home in a very real way. And I must confess, as somebody who used to be a senior official at Natural Resources Canada and spent a lot of time thinking about different aspects of energy, there were lots of those aspects that I didn't think about. We tended to focus on specific things that were government priorities, and so thank you for reminding us of one of those aspects that does often tend to get forgotten. So our next speaker is got the job of not forgetting all of those aspects. So over to you, Debbie.
I put it on. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thanks. So great. Thank you so much for having me here today. Thanks, Mike, and to all the conference organizers. This morning, I thought I'd tackle this topic in 3 different ways. So the first one is by looking at the important impacts and implications that the recent global events are having on energy security and getting to net zero in Canada. And then to consider what such a highly volatile global environment means for Canada. And finally, maybe some considerations, maybe you want to call them principles, that will help us successfully navigate through such uncertain times. So no one, of course, in this room is going to be surprised when I say that the global pandemic and Russia's illegal invasion of the Ukraine have jolted global energy systems. Sudden extreme volatility has become the norm rather than the exception. And traditional energy producers were the first to bear the brunt of COVID-19's impact on global energy markets. And almost overnight, we all know the demand for oil and gas dropped, leading to a collapse in prices and exposing the vulnerabilities in high-cost oil and gas producers. COVID-19 brought the term resiliency into everyday parlance. The International Energy Agency recommended that countries strengthen their resiliency to such external shocks by implementing green economic recovery measures with the potential to add energy security co-benefits. Most OECD countries, including Canada, saw this as an opportunity to accelerate the transition to clean energy and a clean energy future. And many began making major investments in climate action as part of their post-COVID recovery plans. Like the pandemic, Russia's invasion of Ukraine triggered another recalibration, again, with a focus on climate policies, energy security and affordability, supply chains, and decarbonization. Responses have varied around the world, but we're starting to see the global reconfiguration of energy demand and supply patterns, much of it driven by the European Union's goal of ending its reliance on Russian oil and gas. So all of this brings me to Canada. And how are we positioned amid these tumultuous changes in the global energy system? Let me start by a few quick facts, which probably most of you know in the room, but I will reiterate them anyway. We are, by and large, an energy secure nation because we have significant and diverse energy resources in this country and a highly integrated energy system with the United States. For example, we're a top 5 global producer of hydroelectric power, uranium, oil and gas, and a top 10 global producer of things like liquid biofuels, nuclear energy, hydrogen, and wind power. And because of our close relationship with the United States, they're a primary export for a primary market for our energy exports. And we know some of the statistics around how much of our energy goes there. But despite all of that, we are not without our vulnerabilities. Canada still imports energy from the United States, roughly 20-25% of oil and gas. And that integration means that changes in US policy can impact our energy and economic security. And like every major oil exporting nation, we are susceptible to that global volatility in oil markets, and that can have an outsized impact on today's national economy in Canada. And similarly, as I heard a little bit of a piece on critical minerals in the previous section, that is emerging now as a new major geostrategic and security concern for Canada. So the challenge for Canada is to ensure that we can continue to benefit from the comparative advantages that we've had till today, to have access to support secure and affordable energy while trying to get on the path to net zero. That is the challenge that we have. But to be clear, the net zero goal is going to define our long-term energy security and success. And Minister Wilkinson touched upon this in his recent G7 meetings in Berlin, when he outlined how Canada can become a global leader in energy solutions that advance security, affordability, and climate objectives. Central to that is providing clarity and certainty to investors who can develop those sources of clean and secure energy. Given the importance of emission reductions as a core objective to the energy transition, we also have to look at all solutions that could bring cost effectiveness, as opposed to focusing on a particular technology or a particular energy source. So for Canada, that means growing our supplies of clean power and using technologies to harness renewable energy, accelerating the switch to clean fuels, securing our critical mineral supply chains, and increasing our energy efficiency measures. And we can do that by actually investing in those critical mineral supply chains, and I'm sure there'll be some questions around that. Diversifying our energy sources. We have hydrogen infrastructure to build. We have small modular reactors. We have biofuels. There's a lot that we can move forward with there. And preparing the electricity grid for the net zero future, investing in strategic interties, in energy storage, in renewable energy, in smart grids. Having said that, there's no perfect answer, but I believe there are some principles or considerations that we could use to navigate through all of this volatility and ensure energy security as we get to net zero. And they include things like, 1, planning for the long term, not just for the next 4 years. Balancing energy security, affordability, and sustainability upfront in decision-making, not after the fact. Enhancing resiliency through stable supply chains, decarbonizing our power systems, stronger cybersecurity, and infrastructure designed to withstand the extreme weather events of the future. Diversify, 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 part of the resiliency question, both our energy mixes, our imports, and our technologies. Ensuring predictable and stable policy signals, and making sure that those policies align with stock turnover, investment cycles, so that we don't end up with unnecessary costs. And finally, to contribute to global energy security in integrated markets. So these are some things that can guide us as we look forward. And I believe that we can create a secure, reliable, and affordable energy future, and one that gets us to net zero. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you, Debbie, and those the principles you outlined at the end there, I think are helpful as a frame for thinking about that. And again, I'm reminded of when I was at NRCan, and I'm not sure that we had anything quite that like that in our minds. A lot of it was kind of making it up as we went along. As I said, policymakers aren't always that good at making policy. But maybe we're making progress in the right direction. And again, I go back to Monica's earlier comment about the unnamed professor who said that energy policy is climate policy. So far, at least this morning, I think we've spent some time debunking that pretty thoroughly. And so what we've heard on this panel has debunked it more thoroughly still. So again, obviously looking for questions from the floor, and we're in good time. So I encourage people to jump in, but again, I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative. And maybe for all of you, all three of you, just to kind of, we always talk about keeping multiple objectives in sight. We always talk about taking a systems approach, and most people agree that that makes a lot of sense until we actually have to do it. It's hard to do, it's complicated, it's extremely hard to communicate. And in a world, in a democratic world, in a political world, that's extremely important. Policymakers don't necessarily take easily to balancing multiple objectives, particularly when they're contradictory, because again, it goes to how can you communicate it without sounding like you're obfuscating. And of course, that's even harder for people like regulators. So for each of you, some simple advice to policymakers is to what are the things we need to do to succeed in that balancing act over the long run? I'm going to, Debbie, I'm going to start with you.
Start with me. Okay, great. So I'm going to quote Minister Wilkinson only one more time, then I promise I won't do that again. But he said, surely as a G7 nation, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. And I think that that's probably a good way to start my answer is like, I'm a big proponent of your solution set is going to be different depending on what you choose to consider upfront. And I think what you heard from my opening remarks is this is no longer a how do I reduce the next unit of GHGs? It's a conversation around how do we build an affordable, secure, reliable, and clean energy system. And if we consider all of those factors up front, then you may find your solution set looks very different. And the mitigating measures you would consider putting in place up front versus dealing with problems down the road. And I do want to give one very tangible example of something that we launched at NRCan, which is trying to get at exactly that, very practical. On June 1st, we did announce the launch of the regional energy and resource tables. And I think in the previous session, someone raised the question of partnership, because I think that's a really critically important piece of this as well. So the idea on the regional energy and resource tables is to do exactly that. How can we, in partnership amongst governments, speaking about how do we get things done faster, in partnerships among government, try and put our weight behind a small number of things that can be real difference makers for our move to a net zero economy that works in each individual part of this country. Canada is not a homogeneous place. We are actually a very heterogeneous place. So even a discussion around security, affordability, reliability looks very different in Alberta than it looks in the Atlantic or that it looks in Quebec. So having those discussions regionally and thinking about how can we bring economic prosperity? How could we build an affordable and reliable energy system underneath the economic industries of the future? How could we make sure that we have the right workers in place with the right skills available for those industries? And to have that conversation in partnership with provinces and others, Indigenous communities, the private sector upfront to design those solutions together. So that's a very pragmatic example of how we're trying to take policy in the direction of integrating these issues upfront and designing our actions and policies around a broader solution set.
Okay, well, thank you. Emily, why don't I turn to you and your thoughts on, you got 2 minutes with the policymaker and you're going to, okay, here are the things you need to think about to get that balancing act. What would you say?
I have 2 suggestions. Suggestion number 1, and I will say this to my dying day, better engagement, not consultation, engagement with lived experience communities. We are the experts in our realities. We can give you immediate feedback on the effectiveness of your policy. I think there's a lot of information about the ability of a lot of communities to be able to think critically about their environment. This is completely untrue. They're experts in the systems that they use. So, and the government has the capacity to be constantly engaging with these communities to ensuring that policies and affordable energy programs, affordable energy benefits are actually adequately meeting community needs. I think another thing the government can also do is create more ambitious accountability measures for themselves. And these accountability measures be based in human rights and sustainable development goals approaches. And by that, I mean, if the goal is for a government to produce an affordable energy and a sustainable energy grid for a population, but there is a large portion of that population that is still finding energy unaffordable, is choosing between food and heating or medication and heating, which we see across the country all the time, whether it be in the winter or now in extreme heats where some people don't even have access to AC or let alone can afford to turn their AC on, then you know instantly that your policy is failing and that then you can look to your accountability mechanism and do better. I think stronger accountability mechanisms is something that the government must set for themselves in order to actually achieve effective and groundbreaking policies and programs for people.
Okay, thank you. Catherine.
So I smiled at the walking and chewing gum comments because I was basically going to say the same thing. It's really the job of policymakers to balance all those competing objectives, despite what might be the perspectives of the public at any individual moment. I can't really speak for the Canadian situation here, but something that we have in Britain is that the very structure of our political system undermines the skill set that's needed within government to deliver on these objectives. Politicians are elected for relatively short periods of time, and senior politicians tend to get moved between different departments. And we also see those types of rotations within the civil service. So this really undermines the ability of individuals to build the level of expertise that's needed to really understand the markets and be able to anticipate what could be the impacts of different policy choices. And that's a significant problem here, lack of expertise within key decision makers. And I don't know if that's sort of reflections in Canada, but the short-term nature of the political cycle is quite a difficult one in this context, because these are complex markets, and you need to really understand how they work at a fundamental level to make sure that you don't introduce unintended consequences of the type that we're seeing here in Britain at the moment.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to open the floor to one comment or question in the back, and then another one over here.
Hi, Paul.
Great. Thanks for the comments. Paul Chiliak with the Canadian Gas Association. Thanks for putting this on, Monica and team, and thanks Debbie and the speakers and Mike for moderating. Debbie, you mentioned the goal is a clean, affordable, reliable energy system of the future. I don't think we can ever get all three of those. That's the goal, but getting all three is really hard. For the current government, it appears as if clean is probably the largest priority, and for good reason, because affordability and reliability really weren't topics in the news for the last 7 years. They are now. So if you had to pick two of those three, what two do you pick? And has there been a rebalancing of those three if you can't answer the first part?
Well, I don't know if I could speak on behalf of the government of Canada, which two out of the three that I would pick. But as a total pragmatist,
Not for long, anyway.
yeah. Debbie Sharp here. I think you have to do the best you can to maximize them, but the reality is you're not going to get everything you want. We never get everything that we want in life. That's just sort of the way it goes. But I do believe that if you don't think about them all up front, you're definitely not going to get the maximum out of all three of them. And those trade-offs, you could argue, are really on a case-by-case policy basis. In some cases, we might say, the energy poverty question is such a significant issue in this space that there needs to be thought around that. In other areas, perhaps that's not as much of an issue, and security of supply. I think it's going to matter in the nature of the conversation you're having. I don't think I could say up front, like, these two will take precedent over the other. But I'm also a pragmatist in that you have to find a best solution set, but there's definitely going to be trade-offs. So I know that's not answering your question, Paul, but it's kind of the work that we have to do. And I'd say, like, the good news is that's how we're looking at it, as opposed to just looking at it from one of the three. And I think that's probably one of the steps forward we've taken in the years that have evolved, Mike, since you're in the public service.
Okay, well, and of course, Mick Jagger had some very good advice on that. You can't always get what you want, but if you try sometime, you just might find you get what you need. And if you peel that away, that's actually very good advice. One of the great philosophers of the 20th century. So next question, unless Emily or Catherine, whether you'd like to weigh in on that.
Yeah, so I would just reflect on what we're seeing here in Britain, which is that although there's been a huge focus on decarbonisation and net zero ambitions in the last few years, right now the government is scrambling to keep old coal power stations open for security of supply reasons, and having to subsidise end users to cover their energy costs. So I think when push comes to shove, decarbonisation becomes deprioritised. I mean, I think that's the reality. Energy poverty kills people in very short time frames, and so does lack of security of supply. You know, if you have disconnections, it costs lives. And although obviously people argue that climate change can cost lives, it doesn't tend to over the same time frame and with the same degree of immediacy. And when people are facing those challenges and they're all over the newspapers, the priorities can change really quickly.
Okay.
Understood.
We had another question. Yeah.
Can you hear me? Oh, there we
Yep.
go. Code Advance with Finance Canada, although emphasizing that I am not speaking on behalf of my employer, et cetera. So I have kind of a double-barreled question, which I realize is a no-no, but I'm going to do it anyway. I guess the question I have is regarding fuel poverty, and this can be answered by anyone. Regarding fuel poverty, like, is this actually a failure of the energy system, or is this a failure of the social safety net in the UK or Canada? Like, if people cannot afford to heat their homes, isn't the solution to provide them with better employment, higher minimum wages, if they're disabled, providing them with a better disability payments, et cetera, like, aren't there ways that don't maybe compromise some of our other goals to address the specific problems of those communities? And then I guess a related question is, at least in Canada, I can't speak for the UK, but the main way that the government has decided to induce emissions reduction is through a carbon pricing system. And they've decided on that because they said this is the most efficient way to do it. It doesn't pick winners and losers, et cetera. But I think what all this discussion is pointing to is that there is a real risk of adverse consequences and perhaps a political and public backlash around that. So I guess the question that creates for me is, doesn't that augur for a more sort of supply-based response to the challenges of reaching net zero? And perhaps, you know, we do have to start talking about, air quotes, picking winners and losers and some sort of industrial policy around this, because we've relied on this one mechanism. And then for other reasons, the assumptions that we made, which I think we're speaking to by the previous questioner, are no longer holding. So I guess anyone can answer that. And thank you for your time.
Okay. Well, it's a sort of a multi-part question, or at least two distinct parts. And Emily, I wanted to ask you to respond to it first.
Thank you. So I'll speak to the first part of your question because I feel like that's sort of where my expertise lie more in regards to is energy poverty you know, an issue of governments needing a better social safety net versus the actual affordability of the energy, gas, et cetera. Well, I mean, these systems are privatized for the most part. So if the government, if there's sort of no government control over what the cost is, there is always that profit incentive. Now, if the government just continues to, you know, fuel in supports, increase minimum wages, increased income supports, etc. I mean, there's nothing stopping companies from raising prices, and it's just going to be like a race towards inflation. So we always advocate for balanced approaches. As of course, you need that social safety security net for people who fall through the cracks, for people who are just hovering around the poverty line and are struggling to afford those basic necessities. But we also need to address, you know, climate resiliency and affordability for everyone, so that you know, people who, so that prices don't just become out of reach for the middle class. And you know, perhaps not completely parallel, but I like to point to the housing market, where we can keep throwing and talking about putting supply on the market, but then if you're not really producing the right kind of supply, and you're not regulating how much supply costs, and you know, who can buy versus who can't buy, then you're going to have a housing market that, despite adding to it, you know, year after year, is still out of reach for many low-income people. Thank you.
Catherine, knowing some of your work, I'm sure you have something to contribute here. Your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think part of the question is, why are the energy prices so high to begin with? Obviously, we've got the impact of wholesale prices. in Britain, on top of wholesale prices, end users have to pay network costs and the costs of environmental and social policies. And those actually, before we had the increase in wholesale prices in last autumn, those collectively were making up almost half of the bill. So network costs and environmental policy costs were just under 50% of what end users were paying. And it's actually quite a regressive way to recover those policy costs. And the network costs are in part policy costs as well, because when you decide you want to completely change your energy system, then that increases network costs, as I was saying earlier. So there's been a lot of discussion around this in Britain, whether these costs should be recovered through bills, because the people who are the least able to impact their own consumption then pay a disproportionate cost. If you're living in fuel poverty and you're choosing between heating and eating, you can't afford to have solar panels, and you probably don't even own the property in which you live, so don't have the ability to install solar panels if you wanted to. The same with better insulation, with better windows, with more efficient appliances and so on. And so the people in the greatest need have the least ability to reduce their costs. And this is very regressive, and is something that's a subject for significant debate. You could change that by recovering those sorts of costs through general taxation instead. And a lot of low-income people don't pay income tax. And so that would be probably a more equitable way of addressing it. So I suppose the answer is a little bit of both. It's you look at what's causing prices to be high, and are the components of those prices reasonable and being recovered in an appropriate way.
Okay, thank you. Debbie, anything to? Oh, sorry. Oh, go ahead.
In the telecommunications sector, the prices were high because they were controlled by essentially monopolies, and the regulatory environment actually protected them. It's still protecting them. Competitors in telecommunications are still on a non-level playing field through the complicity or even the support of the CRTC. What we found is when competitors entered the marketplace, prices went down. So I think most of us remember when a long distance phone call cost a fortune. Now we can video call anywhere in the world for free. I'm seeing the same thing in the energy sector. I'm new in the energy sector. I'm here, I'm learning, but I'm seeing that the energy sector in Canada is anti-competitive and resists innovation. And our governments are actually protecting the incumbents. We need to actually encourage innovation and competition so that startups and competitive organizations can deliver energy services for much less. I'm grieved to hear that energy poverty is killing people, but we know it's true, whether it's in cold climates or hot climates. There are innovative startup solutions that are cheaper than incumbent solutions. When you have large incumbent organizations delivering solutions, they have to deliver at a higher cost. They have to cover their fixed assets, their high cost processes. Startups, innovative companies have a much lower cost of delivering services. And we can make reliable, affordable, sustainable energy cheaper. It can be cheaper if you let competitors do it and you don't stack the playing field against competitors and for the incumbents.
Okay,
Thank
I
you.
wonder if any of our panelists want to pick up on that one. I don't hear anybody. Emily, yeah, please.
Well, I'll just quickly note, I think telecommunications is a great example of when government does it wrong. We're a nonpartisan organization. I'm not going to be here to advocate for, how much government should be involved, because we don't want to necessarily get involved in, capitalism versus greater social security nets. But your example of, how government control fails is a super valid one. But then look at the housing sector where, jurisdictions that have little government control have the highest rent prices and have the highest housing prices. So it doesn't necessarily, just because you have a free market system doesn't necessarily mean it's going to benefit, the low income vulnerable people. So I would challenge you to think critically about what you're saying, because you need checks and balances. You can't just let the free market run amok. You need to ensure that services, and these are not just markets, these are basic necessities that people have human rights and are entitled to through the UN Declaration of Human Rights that Canada has committed towards. So we can't just think about these things as profits, markets. We have to think about these things as basic services that we need to provide to the people. And there needs to be a better balance between the private and the government sector. And again, I'm not saying the government always does it right, but at least it has the power that if, it creates accountability mechanisms, it creates policies that are based in human rights and dignity to ensure that, again, I'm always going to advocate for the people living in poverty are accessing services, and telecommunications is a thing that we talk a lot about in the poverty advocacy world. So yes, I'm not saying the government always does it right, but I also would caution, the argument that just let it all go to the private market, free hand competition. I don't necessarily think people always have vulnerable communities in their best interest.
Okay. Anybody else? Sorry,
So,
Catherine.
if I could jump in there. So the British government has spent the last 3 decades now since privatization trying to stimulate competition and actually reducing the market share of the incumbents, and had some success with this. But last year, half of the suppliers in the market went bankrupt, costing consumers billions of pounds. And the reason for this was that a lot of these new entrants were very thinly capitalized, and they had unsustainable business models. And I actually would challenge this assumption that that new entrants can be more efficient. The costs that incumbents have incurred in building their operations are real costs that need to be recovered. They're not fake costs. And it may be that in some cases they weren't as efficient as they could be. But if people are trying to undercut those without doing the work, if you like, which is what we saw here in Britain, that's not sustainable. And in the end, those businesses fail and they take customer money with them. So I think it's really important that while competition absolutely has a role to play, and I'm a huge believer in free markets, we have to have the appropriate market structures and regulation in place to protect the interests of consumers.
And okay, we have more questions. I was going to say, Monica, we'll have to note this for future conferences. There's several panels on this topic alone, and it goes very much to some of the work we've been doing recently with some of our other colleagues. But important point. And there is a question, I'm told, over.
Hi, Amanda Rosenstock here. My question is for Debbie and Catherine in particular. We heard earlier about this choice between winners and losers. And one thing I hear consistently from clean technology stakeholders is that government needs to be more focused in their approach to investments in clean technology. But then you also have others in the space, like certain economists, who are saying, no, that's not the role of government to pick winners and losers. And we know that we have a particular challenge around the scale up of clean technology companies in Canada. So particularly from, the Minister of Natural Resources point of view, what approach should we be taking? And Catherine, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. Government doesn't like to pick winners and losers. And I think everyone will tell us we picked all the wrong winners or all the wrong losers. How I thought about it is perhaps we have to start picking the right races to be in. So, sort of the right trajectories or the right pathways or the right spaces where it's not necessarily picking a technology, but it's picking a pathway that we think is going to get us to success. And so I like to think about it a bit more from that perspective. And I do think, I believe that there are comparative advantages in this country as an energy producer. Canada is an energy producer. Perhaps the type of energy we make is going to change and evolve over time, look a bit different, look a bit of the same, but we still are an energy producer and we still have comparative advantages, and we should build on those things. We should build on our comparative advantages because you can't win every race globally. So where can you win? And we should be putting some more weight behind those. And I think we have a good idea of where some of those races are. And I think there's a bit more of a trend in trying to identify those comparative advantages and try and get into those races. So that's probably the best way that I can say sort of how we've evolved a bit of our thinking. But certainly it is a tough space around the winners and losers discussion.
Yep, indeed. Catherine, did you want to respond?
Yeah, so I'd say I think it should be a bit of both. I see energy security as a core role of government in the same way that physical security is a role of government. You know, you expect the government to have armed forces and police and so on to maintain physical safety for people. And I see energy security in a similar way. So I think it's legitimate for governments to have some role in this. Now, I don't believe in central planning, and I don't think the government should sit there and map out exactly what the energy system should look like. But when you think about things like nuclear power, which, and I know it's controversial, but actually does meet a lot of the objectives of the energy transition, nuclear projects have incredibly high capital costs, which are pretty much beyond the reach of private investors. So it's a natural place for governments to step in and provide support. And I think if governments recognize that they should take on this type of role, you avoid the sort of short-term emergency measures that we're seeing the British government making now, which is basically trying to enter into special contracts with coal producers to keep coal capacity online, which was never part of any kind of strategy. The government wants to close coal, but it wants to keep the lights on more. And so right now it's having to come up with a special subsidy regime for coal power stations to support the system through the winter. That is not a good way to run energy policy. So I think if governments adopt a willingness to do some amount of direct intervention and technology picking, it doesn't have to be for the whole market, but it can be for part of it, and develop that as part of the overall solution.
Okay, thank you. Rick?
Hi, I'm bringing a question from a virtual participant, actually, who would like to know the speaker's perspective on costs and affordability in a way that includes the social cost of carbon. So the underlying cost of heat bombs in British Columbia, drought, tornadoes and storms, impacts on fisheries, etc. And how do we balance the underlying costs and instability that climate change brings with the other costs of security and reliability? Thank you.
Okay, and that one's for all the speakers. And
well, I can say on social cost of carbon, we actually do have a social cost of carbon. We actually do look at it in the context of our regulatory decision making. It is a proxy, obviously, for a number of other factors, but that is something that we think about in the types of policies that we do have, so as not to exclude those particular types of issues. And sometimes they change the balance of what policies make sense or don't make sense. So, so that would be sort of the short answer to the question.
okay, if I may, I mean, I might have thought that the carbon tax is in effect a reflection of the social
cost of carbon.
social cost of carbon, right? Catherine or Emily, any thoughts on that question?
We have carbon pricing in the UK as well, but it's not really developed in any sort of particularly scientific way. So we have a floor price for carbon, and we also have carbon units trading in the market, and they actually are imposing quite a burden on the market. It's a significant component in what end users are paying. So I think it's easy to get into sort of circular arguments with this, and a lot depends on the way that you're modeling these things to begin with. So I can see why they're useful, but I also think they can be, need to be treated with some caution.
Indeed. Emily?
Yeah, I mean, I just to sort of single out an important point you brought up in terms of industry is, fisheries, but we're also thinking of migrant workers and people with precarious jobs who work in agriculture, a lot of these low-income wages where their jobs are already perhaps precarious. And if greater climate disasters impact their ability to work, well, what is their future work going to look like for them? Will we have a proper, for example, EI system? Will we have a proper social security net available for them? So, in the social costs, we definitely have to think about jobs and housing, transit systems, how we ensure that there's a trampoline, ensuring that we can push people back up when they fall because of climate changes, etc. So thank you for bringing that industry and jobs aspect to the conversation.
Okay, time for one last question. There we go.
Yeah, thank you. So I think most would agree that the energy transition is going to incur costs to some degree to end consumers. And I believe when you look at the history of the federal convening and spending power, particularly in situations where there are big losers, whether it's regionally or kind of individually, as one of the speakers was speaking to. There's a strong role for the federal government in smoothing out these inequities often. And, I know we're approaching fiscal pressures as a country, but nonetheless, I kind of am not the first one to do this. Look back to Depression era when we dealt with healthcare policy in trying financial times. So can you maybe just speak to the role of the federal convening and spending power and maybe helping to smoothen out these inequities that will kind of inevitably emerge with the energy transition?
Yeah, fair enough. So maybe I'll say is what government's doing a lot of different things at the same time. And I think it comes back to the question about the carbon price and industrial policy. So on the one hand, yes, we have regulatory measures. Yes, we have things that we're going to say you could no longer do going forward. And those things will incur costs. And those costs may not be distributed evenly across the country, in particular, depending on what type of energy system exists, going back to the regional differences. So when you talk about electricity, Alberta is in a very different situation than Quebec, and will certainly feel the impacts of moving to a clean grid more than a province like Quebec. So yes, you have to move on regulatory discussions, but you also have to move on investment decisions as well. So I think what you're seeing coming from the federal government is now packages of measures where we want to say, we want to do less of this, but we want to do more of this. And we need measures on both sides of the ledger to be able to have these energy systems transformed. And we can't be all here and we can't be all here, but we have to actually see what is the portfolio of levers and tools that will get us to where we want to go and minimize where we understand those impacts to be. So that's really the direction. I think that federal policy, that's the direction, that's what federal policy is doing right now. If you look at whether it's the climate plan, if you look at the types of programs and levers that exist federally, how tax measures are being brought to bear, in my view, it's that portfolio of measures to balance where we want to get to and manage the type of growth we'd like to see. And that does come back to the question about pollution pricing and industrial policy, is that the concept of industrial policy is emerging in the discourse more and more. And it comes back to this question of what are the types of energy systems we want to build? Where do we want to see Canada positioned globally? Whether it's critical minerals, whether it's small modular reactors, whether it's hydrogen, there is an undertone of industrial policy that's emerging in this discourse, in this discussion, coupled with regulatory investments, et cetera. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a sense of where we're going.
Okay, and Catherine and Emily, I'm not sure that either of you would feel well positioned to answer that particular question, but what I'm going to do is say last word from any of you, and then we're going to wrap it up. So Catherine, last word on anything.
Well, I mean, I suppose what we've been talking about is what we've in Britain called the energy trilemma, which is balancing decarbonisation, affordability and security of supply, and recognising that at different times we'll prioritise different aspects of that, and that's also probably okay. At the end of the day, we need to think about welfare and the welfare of citizens and the people that the governments are there to serve. And that isn't going to be the same, their needs aren't the same all the time. And we need to be responsive and responsible in the way we construct our policies. Okay, Emily, any last words?
Just echoing what Catherine said, at the end of the day, who is the energy for? Who are these systems for? They're for people, and people are currently in various economic conditions, and with the high cost of living, food and housing in particular, we need to ensure that energy is affordable for people who, have disabilities, who are unable to work, and then also crucially, we're seeing people who are working full-time skilled jobs making $60,000 a year, but are unable to afford rent and just the mounting costs of living today. So again, as I think, just to echo a lot of the themes that came out, policy doesn't work in silos. Things need to be interconnected, and it's the government's job to think about these things in holistic and sustainable ways. And at the end of the day, these are, I'm going to say it again, these are human rights issues that we're dealing with. People's ability to live in a safe and efficient shelter, to be able to protect themselves from extreme weather, not only by having access to those systems, I'm speaking physical heating and AC systems, but also being able to afford them. So I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, and Debbie, I think you probably had your last word, or did you want to?
Maybe I'll just say 2 sentences in that we have a relatively affordable and secure energy system in Canada today, and we need to build on that comparative advantage to make sure that we don't lose that benefit to Canada as we go forward with our policies.
Okay, good note to end on. And so that's it for this panel. My last word is that after we've had a chance to thank the panelists for their excellent contribution, we're going to break for lunch, and I believe we reconvene. We have speakers at 12:30. But before we go and grab some lunch, please join me in thanking our panelists.